aid to various countries, but we really rely on public-private partnerships so that we can have that collaboration, we can have those relationships. So when a disaster strikes, whether it's here domestically or globally, we have those relationships set up. So for example, Ebola, we were able to send in 300 pallets of personal protective equipment to healthcare workers in Sierra Leone. And without our relationships with our freight forwarders, we would not have been able to do that. You know, most of the transportation providers were unwilling to fly into Sierra Leone or Liberia due to the threat of Ebola. But having the relationships over many years, trusting that our supply chain would be able to be secure enough to protect the transporters and the pilots, we were able to airlift in 300 pallets of supplies into Sierra Leone. So just underlines the relationship aspect and the collaboration. I'll also give an example in Haiti. So the Haiti earthquake that was mentioned. We as in the humanitarian industry really learned a lot from that disaster. You have hundreds of nonprofits that are trying to get aid into Haiti. And what we really found was there was two disasters. The first was the earthquake. The second was just the amount of aid that was pouring into that country with no real plan for distribution. So we found that every time there's a disaster that we're responding to, that it's important that there's a reflection done after that disaster to understand how can we get better, where do we need to develop partnerships, where do we need to collaborate more, and how can we develop best practices from the lessons learned from each disaster. And with that, I think I'll pass it on to Ms. Gale.
I'm going to not make other comments and open it up for everyone's questions, right, Linda?
I'll let you hang on to that. And I'll stand. Yes, ma'am. Alicia.
Okay, I don't have a microphone, so.
Yeah, so if you'll, we just, because we're videotaping, if you will speak as loudly as you can from the diaphragm, we'll be good.
Excellent. So,
Thank you, ma'am. Name and affiliation, so we do get to all meet each other here.
so I'm Alicia Griswold. I'm an emergency manager with the King County Office of Emergency Management. So Gail was actually in my home yesterday. Thank you for that. I'm curious if it's possible to start pitching the rebuilding of our critical infrastructure and hardening those resources as a homeland security issue, because right now I'm really struggling and fighting tooth and nail just to do cybersecurity exercising up against first responders that tend to get the lion's share of homeland security grant money. So is there a way that we can start looking at our road systems, our bridges, our ports as homeland security issues? Because like we saw with SR 530, if we lose that connectivity, that causes serious economic impact, arguably just as impactful to the local economies as the actual disaster itself.
One of the deficiencies of there are many deficiencies of the Homeland Security movement in this country since 9/11, was we really never got into it with the public about what could happen, how bad it could be, and why they're having to pay all this money for stuff. And that's because they'll find people with baseball caps and leather jackets and boats and vans that nobody can use, because that was what you were allowed to buy for the first 5 years. Not because we were that stupid, but because the only things you could acquire, since you couldn't hire staff to plan, was basically stuff. That's changed a lot. But I said this just the other day to a gentleman named Mike Walker, who's a very senior, he's a former Assistant Secretary of Defense and all that. He just finished talking about a broad range of homeland security issues that we have, and particularly speaking about global jihadism and how it might impact us. Unless we start talking to people about how each of these elements fits into the interdependencies we have in this country, that whether it's the food chain being disrupted, it affects us who eat the food, it affects Alaska who starves after an earthquake. But unless we talk about the impact on the farmer that grows the food, that can't sell it because it can't go on a train because the train tracks haven't been maintained, and then our supply chain gets disrupted, there's a whole lot of folks at either end of the chain that are impacted as well. What we have to get away from is thinking that a lot of us are our own little ball of humanity. Everything we're talking about affects more people than just us, more people than just the people in the chain of transfer of goods and services and food and products and stuff across the world. It affects us in so many other ways. And if someone really wants to hurt us, they'll get our supply chain. I would think if they had any brains at all, that's what they'd really be doing. Because we, and you can edit that part out just in case that they're watching. But it seems to me that what I said to this former general was, you know, we ought to start trusting our people as much as Al-Qaeda seems to trust their people. We ought to tell them about what the cyber threat could mean to everything, whether it's traffic signals or anything else. Why don't we tell them what some of those problems are? Because the bad guys already know what the problems are. They haven't figured out how to deliver a punch like that, but they could. And I know there's some security issues, but we don't even have that much trust within government. I will tell this. I know of a period of time where a Homeland Security advisor to a sitting governor was being told he couldn't go to a meeting on cybersecurity not too long ago, a few years ago, because he wasn't cleared by the Defense Department to talk to him, that the CTO could be in there. That made no sense to me. It got fixed pretty quickly, but that's the kind of nonsense that we deal with sometimes in government. And so what we need to do is figure out what we can tell the American people and what we can tell in our communities, and really lean on the notion that, look, you've got a part of this too. In an earthquake, we tell you, your job is to have personal preparedness equipment. You've got to have water for a few days. You've got to be able to sustain yourself. You've got to do all those things. Well, there's some things we need to pay for too. And I think the hard part is nobody these days in elected office is saying loudly enough and effectively enough, some of this stuff costs money we're going to have to pay for. But it doesn't necessarily come to me, and it shouldn't necessarily be a mobile van or a helicopter. It might just mean building a capability to preserve and restore our infrastructure and our social equilibrium after a disaster. It is part of a Homeland Security function, but it's also part of a disaster preparedness system. Because the one mistake they made in 2002 that they've never completely corrected is Homeland Security is a subset of emergency management. It's not the big thing. It's the small. It's a component piece. Homeland Security, terrorism, earthquakes, fires, they all fit in that model because we're not anything more than an aura, an entity, and a bridge to other professions and other disciplines. And the emergency management business is too important for just those of us in emergency management.
I'm just going to add one quick thing. Because it's really important that Homeland Security money is influenced by committees in Congress that decide what the budgets will be for various roles and responsibilities. Homeland Security is 10 years old this year as an agency, and it needs a complete reevaluation of what it spends its money on next. And we do at the state as well. So Eric's point about fix it when it fails is completely contrary to the problem that we have at the local jurisdictions and at the state jurisdictions of investing in critical infrastructure. Critical infrastructure monies are available not in the Department of Homeland Security, they're in the Department of Transportation and in the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, and some in the Coast Guard, and mostly in the Army Corps of Engineers, which is the Department of Army, Department of Defense budgets. So we have a pool table of pockets of money that are not directly related to where we know we need to spend money locally and at the state level. And I am working on that because I am trying to define critical infrastructure needs in a different way. I'm doing it through a legislative task force that we've set up as looking at the critical infrastructure our economy needs in Washington State and what are the risks to our economy, because that is a Homeland Security concern. But it's going to be tapping money from different sources to do federal matching monies to what we do at the state and local level, and we have to do it in a different way. It's going to be a very heavy lift.
So I'm gonna do Eric, and then we have two other questions. Yeah, two other.
Just real quick to Alicia, if I was the Department of Homeland Security, I'd say we focused on critical infrastructure by emphasizing protection of critical infrastructure. So they had buffer zone protection plans. Anybody remember that? I think that may be dead, or it's really minuscule now. But the thrust was we got to protect the critical infrastructure. Have a lot of familiarity with the maritime side of that. There was $400 million a year going. This region, sector of Puget Sound, when the money was flowing like milk and honey, you know, about 4 years ago, was getting about $26 billion a year. That was way beyond anything that was going to state and local emergency managers for things. So there's a lot of fencing done. We built the Seattle Navy with fire and police boats and command vehicles and all those types of things. Well, that's dwindled now, and I think there's some realization that resilience is coming up, that you can't protect everything. You need to look for your single points of failure and try and protect those, and we have things like that in this region that would really be significant. And just talking about cyber, just watch, the risks continue to go higher. There's this thing called the Internet of Things, where everything is going to be connected. Your refrigerator, your furnace, I mean, you know, just everything's going to be connected. That's going to create more vulnerability. So the focus on resilience versus protection, I think, is the way to go.
So I've got actually Marvin and then Carlos. I'll get, but introduce yourself, please, sir.
Hi, I'm Marvin Ferrer with APM Terminals. I'm the Safety and Security Manager for the company here in Washington. I serve on a couple committees with the Coast Guard Area Maritime Security Committee, and until recently I was on the Infrastructure Protection Subcommittee for the Governor Committee on Homeland Security, and I know there's some things going with that. So some wonderful things were identified here, and in answer to partly your question and a question forward, we talked about silos and the need to kill silos, and this is being illuminated in these answers and in this discussion. We talked about collaboration of public and private in various ways. We talked about identifying problems so that we can mitigate the risks that those problems give us. You know, we talked about redundancy, we talked about abilities, we talked about communication. All these things are so important because there's a ton of money, you just heard, spent on port security. And what did we buy? We bought fences and barriers and all these things that they identified in their little silo was really important and didn't go to the interdependencies of the other sectors or emergency management ESFs and say, oh, how is this affected by that? Or how is that affected by this? What can we do to bring them together? I'm kind of known by the Coast Guard guys of using a term, link and sync. Link and synchronize, not sink and ship.
I was going to ask you about that.
Okay? They like to say that I'm sinking ships, but that's the Navy guy working for the Coast Guard. But we got to start linking and syncing, and we got to start doing it at every level. Federal government, silos, okay? State silos, the counties, the communities. We got to get past this me-ism and get to the we-ism. And we got to start sharing information. We got to start sharing resources, and we have to be able to give up a piece of our pie to do that at every level. These silos are killing us, absolutely killing us. Billions of dollars for fences and boats when we could have taken that and spread it across. What's the real threat? What is the real threat to us? The real threat are those smart people out there running around in pajamas that are getting inside our house. They haven't figured out how to do the cyber thing yet? I disagree. They just haven't launched it yet. They know how. They got smart people. They're drawing people into their organizations from all over the world. Highly educated, highly upset, angry, hateful people that just want to hurt us. Us being all of us. The Western world, everybody. And we've got to combat that. Okay? So the money's there. The silos have to get broken down. People have to start understanding in government that we've got to get away from the me and get back to the we. And then we got to start sharing it and doing it. And we've got to get the committees together with the collaboration and the security clearances, if there's a security clearance issue, identify the right people, get them in there and get the smart minds working. And we can do that.
So I'm
And we
gonna-
can get that money.
So I'm
Can
gonna
I make
take,
a quick answer on that? I think it's
yeah,
important to do this.
then we'll go with Carlos.
Very briefly, as president of NEMA, I had to testify in front of Congress on a grant reform proposal that we had written that talked about sharing resources and forcing more cross-planning. It's in the president's budget, which probably means it will never see the light of day, but made it to the president's budget and almost intact. The concept was that whether it's ports or anyone, we had too many silos and too many areas. A lot of people were upset about that because they're spending all their time trying to protect their particular grant program, pre-disaster mitigation, a very good program. We plunged into this larger area. Why? Because we thought if you're talking about this, a firefighter, a fire chief, a police chief, a port leader would be just as concerned about mitigation as anything else. It's just as a feature of what we're trying to do. The port and transit leaderships of the authorities that were representing the industries in Congress stood up and said, we are federal, not local assets. We can't have them mucking about in our money. I just said, then the next time you have a crisis, an active shooter or a fire on your perimeter, call Washington, D.C. and see what you think. The point is, those things are hard to break. As I understand it, there's been some movement in this region to be a little more proactive. I didn't want their money. I wanted to know what they were doing with it so we could complement each other. And I think that was the problem. But the Homeland Security Advisor for the state of Washington, who's the Adjutant General, could not go, when I was there, to the governor and say, Governor, I think what's going on, but I can't tell you I know what's going on in terms of how we're protecting the entire state, because most of the money, most of it which was unspent at the time, which was a big problem, was unspent by the port and transit authorities. So if we get together and we figure out how to use those dollars more appropriately, that gives us a lot more credibility in Congress and everywhere else. But that hasn't happened yet.
Well, I'm Carlos Smith, and I direct the Supply Chain Management Institute in Central Washington and chair the finance and supply chain area. What I wanted to ask is, because there's an interesting opportunity that academia is playing a role in these days, and I'm going to ask Tim to talk about it. It comes out of the Cascadia Hazard Institute. We talk about silos. Well, the purpose of the Cascadia Hazard Institute is interdisciplinary research. And in particular, I wanted to ask Tim, we were involved on the supply chain with the geology folks, with our economics faculty, with our social sciences faculty, last year on the development of a grant proposal from the National Science Foundation. And the role, the reason for that proposal was specifically to look at, from a modeling scientific standpoint, what happens with an earthquake. How does that hit the physical infrastructure? From my side, how does it impact supply chains? From our social sciences folks who are involved, how does it impact neighborhoods and interaction with people? And so I think, unfortunately, we didn't get the grant. So I'll ask Representative Thornton if we can find any support for that sort of thing. But I think that's an ideal way that, at least we're trying to start to reach out to that. Now, let Tim talk just a slight bit more about that.
Yeah, what Carla refers to was it was a grant that was submitted to the National Science Foundation. It was not ultimately funded, but that's the cost of doing business with NSF. Submitted. The Cascadia Hazards Institute has submitted probably 15, of which 8 are pending, and half have been funded, half haven't. And the big point of CW's Cascadia Hazards Institute is to de-siloize these different disciplines. And so just to give you an example, I'll talk about this one proposal. When I was in grad school about 20 years ago, an economist my graduate school and a seismologist got together and asked the question, what would actually be the economic damages of a big earthquake through the LA basin, where I was going to school. And they did some fairly back of the envelope type of exercises and came up with just staggering numbers, basically, and this is in 1990 dollars. It was about $1.5 trillion worth of damage to the greater Los Angeles basin infrastructure. And what that ultimately caused were the insurance companies who were providing earthquake insurance to look hard at these numbers. They published this. This was, you know, legitimate science, peer review, and all of that. And it ultimately realized that it's too much money. Like, no insurance can hang themselves out that far for, and you know, the state of California is riddled with earthquake faults, as is Washington. And so ultimately it forced a massive retreat of the insurance from California. And to this day, if you want earthquake insurance in California, you got to go through the state. It's called the California Earthquake Authority. And less than 10% of homeowners have it, okay, because it's very pricey and the damages are so great. So what we wanted to do with this NSF proposal is say, you know, we can solve certain aspects of these problems. If you tell us where the earthquake fault is and how big it is, we can actually do fairly realistic simulations of what the seismic waves will do. That's kind of what we do in my world. But then what does that do to infrastructure? Well, that's more of an engineering aspect as well as a sociological aspect. You got to get in and figure out how buildings were built, not just in the last 10 years, but over the last 100 years, because the buildings of Seattle are the time integral of all the buildings that have been built over the last century and are still standing. So you had to dig that out, and then we could have to simulate what the damages would be, and then what are the economic losses and all of that. And so we did write this proposal, and it was actually a very neat proposal, and NSF made a terrible mistake by not funding it. But the idea was assume a couple of different scenario earthquakes for faults that we know about, put that into supercomputers. So we had a colleague of ours actually in Switzerland who has access to massive, well, both the software to simulate seismic waves and also the computers, the supercomputers to run them on. So we would give them, from our crustal deformation measurements, what kind of fault scenarios would happen, what shaking that would produce, what that would do to the buildings, how many of those would collapse, how many infrastructure failures would we have, how would societies respond, how would communities respond. We had an economics professor, Tony Chippick, also working on what would be the short and long-term losses to infrastructures and businesses. Carlo led the part on trying to figure out what the disruptions to the supply chain would be. And these are all the kind of things you have to think about in addition to, you know, earthquake happens, ground shakes, things fall down, some people get killed, there might be a tsunami, some other people get killed, there's injuries. That is a piece of the earthquake puzzle, but a much bigger piece ultimately is what are the long-term economic losses? And all I got to do is look at Hurricane Katrina and New Orleans. If you remember, okay, the response wasn't everything that we might have all wanted it to be, but in the weeks following that event, the president came in, said, all right, we're gonna rebuild all of this. We're gonna do it right. We're pledging $200 billion, and then Congress said, no, we're not actually gonna pay $200 billion. Okay, and so if you look at today, the population of those regions of New Orleans that were, you know, flooded badly, the population to this day is only half of what it was. And so now, ramp that up by a factor of 10 and have a multi-trillion-dollar earthquake in California or Washington. Who's going to pay that bill? So this was the kind of thing that we wanted to try to study from not just a seismological or a crustal deformation standpoint, but all the way through how do communities respond, what are the economic losses in short and long term, what are the infrastructure losses, what are the business losses from supply chain disruption, and once you characterize it, what would you do about it, and what's the cost-benefit analysis of preparation. So that's one example of the kind of things we're doing at the Cascadia Hazards Institute. It is a, you know, if you sum it up in one phrase, it's to break down these silos that the gentleman talked about.
So one of the things I want to just see if you will show me a show of hands of how many private sector business people do we have in the audience today? All right, very good. So private sector folks, supply chain management folks, I would like to hear from you and your thoughts and your questions, because this is part of what we're hoping to hear today too. Let me just see how many educators and students do we have. Very good. All right, I'm pleased. So, private sector, our industry sector, your thoughts, your questions for our panelists and or each other. All right, Liz.
I'll be brief.
Yes.
I'm Liz, I'm with Amtrak, I'm the Northwest Regional Emergency Manager. I cover 6 states and British Columbia. Our issues, of course, are a little different than like the Port of Tacoma or Amazon, let's say. But our concerns are making sure the word gets out there in the recovery planning and the actual recovery process to make sure that the rail lines get back up, because we provide the people transport. And like with New Orleans, we provided the removal of the people and the repatriation of the folks as much as we were able to from New Orleans when they ran out of the capability of using buses. So again, a little bit different, but very, very critical, because we can't get our systems back online until we have the people able to do that. And it might take longer to get the infrastructure like internet and whatnot back up compared to getting rail lines back up. They're usually pretty fast to get up as long as we get access and are allowed access. So I think this is a great forum, and I'm really pleased that we can participate and have these discussions.
Thank you. Other thoughts, other comments?
Can I tack on to the rail?
Sure.
You know, we talk about redundancy in infrastructure, yet on the rail systems, as I understand it, there are limited bridges across the rivers, limited tunnels, limited routes. Do we have the ability to tell what planning is going on to increase that infrastructure, not just within our state, but interstate, so that we have some redundancy? Because right now, we're pretty maxed out between cargo and passenger rail systems and the canalized points that they have to go to get in and out of state.
Great question. You had something else you wanted to add?
Well, I just wanted to follow up on that a little bit. If you're not aware, BNSF, just as an example, put $5 billion in this last year into double railing across the Bakken and the Highline, so from Chicago over to Idaho. So that's a process that's ongoing. Union Pacific is working on double lining along the Coast Starlight route, which is the route from Washington State down to California. So there are a lot of initiatives going on. Those are just two that I'm pointing out there. Of course, their reason for it is to increase transport of freight and oil transport and other commodities. But you can get a hold of BNSF. The County Emergency Management can get a hold of BNSF or Union Pacific or any rail agency. Not only find out what they're taking through your area and provide that to you in written format and the number of trips per day, but also what they are doing with their infrastructure as far as replacing old infrastructure and putting in new infrastructure.
A really important resource, the Federal Department of Transportation just has established a rule that there can be no money going into states or local jurisdictions to support, quote, freight mobility projects if they have not first been evaluated against a state freight master plan. And so the Washington State Department of Transportation, as well as the Emergency Management Office and the Department of Natural Resources state geologists, have done an extraordinary amount of mapping. It's all available online, looking not only at the rail corridors, but the shipping corridors, the highway system, the aviation infrastructure that supports freight around the state. What is most noticeable when you look at the rail infrastructure? It is very fragile. And I mean fragile in the sense of not the physical condition of it, it's minimal routes. It's exactly what Eric and everyone else has talked about. Maximum efficiency, just in time, operating at whatever capacity you can to save money wherever you can. And so there is very little redundancy, and we're already feeling the consequences of it. We can see what the infrastructure is. We know where the aging issues are in the rail lines themselves. The rail cars need to be enhanced. But what's already happened is the rate of export of the Montana Balkan fuel and the tar sands out of Montana. The rate of exports is consuming access to the rail lines, and it's bumping ag products off the rail lines. So the Port of Seattle, Port of Tacoma, that used to have a predictable amount of freight coming through via rail from eastern Washington and central Washington, those ag exports are now being diverted down to California because oil and gas movement on the rail lines over the last 18 months has literally, in some cases, exploded. And I do want to mention the reason why we have to pay attention to it. It's not just about freight, and it's not just about getting federal money. If there is an oil train derailment explosion in Washington State, we are having an assessment done of the economic impact, the social impact, and the length of time it will take for us to recover. Because our state is not just the most trade-dependent state in the nation, it rides on the rails. The economy literally rides on the rails and on ships. And when we have a disruption in rail activity, it's the entire state's economy. It's not just, Spokane or Vancouver, wherever it happens, or the Port of Seattle.
And I'll just play off that just for a second. I've been working on a cross-border exercise between the central U.S. states and the central provinces, so Manitoba, North Dakota. You have to weigh that fear of a massive, really nasty spill of something that will occur, perhaps on the border, maybe in Brandon, Manitoba, or someplace like that, right on the border. Against the concerns of our fellow citizens in North and South Dakota and other places, because they're experiencing an economic boom that they feel is good for them and their homes. Now, we can say that we have some concerns about that. I do, but I also, having talked to those folks, the jobs are plentiful. People want to protect their own economy. They want to. They're looking at Fargo and Bismarck and Grand Forks as being the center of the universe, just like we think Seattle is and Tacoma is and Wenatchee is, or wherever we live out here. So that's why these discussions are important, because in order to get the kind of action we need. By the way, in Regina, there was just a major spill just within a few days ago. We have designed a similar type of event based on old history and on the current types of rail cars that are actually running or being run. And there have been 3 incidents since we did the design and had to defend why it was plausible. So it's a major concern, and it's you have to approach it not from the standpoint of self-righteousness, but saying, look, we got to find the balance between the economic boom that these people who've been looking for more employment and more opportunities for growth and better schools for their kids, and what the oil companies say they're bringing to the community, and the danger and the threat to all of us. It is not an easy question. That's why dialogue and a lot of it, and with some very clear, honest talk to our citizens and amongst ourselves, is absolutely crucial.
Just real quick, if you're interested in this topic, it's called market access. That's the whole issue of products, raw materials, systems. A lot of it is bulk products, the coal, oil, potash out of Canada, and then freight, of course, going east out of the West Coast ports.
So we have got supply chain educators in our audience today as well. And I would like to perhaps hear from you as to what it is that you've heard so far this morning, and thinking about the work that you're doing in educating our employees and staff that are going to be our future. What are you hearing, and what are your issues or concerns and questions you may have also for your panelists? But thinking about the fact that we also want to hear from and talk about what do we need to be doing as far as education and training related to making sure that all of us who are also in private industry and business have the employees that understand these issues and are helping to make us be more resilient. So I see a hand back here. Go ahead.
Margaret Dunsmore. I am not an educator. I just wanted to throw out to all you people who hire people who are wanting to work in these things. University of Washington has a relatively new Masters of Infrastructure Planning and Management. And if you haven't heard of it, I would suggest, just beeping it online. And these are the people who are really interested because a couple of their classes are on emergency management and others are on every sector of the infrastructure. The public health, the epidemiology, the water system, the energy system, all of this, transportation. So know that they're out there. They're relatively new. The jobs aren't necessarily out there that are, as somebody put it, crossing the T. So many of the jobs are the silo jobs, and these are the people who are coming up. It's a master, so they're not just, brand new to the workforce. They're the people you want to be just being aware they're there and they're going to be looking for jobs. And they have knowledge of the top part of it, the cross the silo business, not just the silos. That's University of Washington, Masters of Infrastructure Planning and Management. Just thought I'd say it's coming your way, those people.
Good.
Thank you.
Is that at the Tacoma campus?
It's at the UW. It's online. The main part of it is online, but they interrelate with other people also.
Highline, Lake Washington Technical College is here, and they have a new supply chain management guy.
My name is Abdul,
Yeah.
and I have a question, or a comment regarding Ebola, which you mentioned that your agency was involved in moving a certain amount of products. One of the biggest issues which they are facing both in Liberia, Sierra Leone, and Guinea, the three countries which have been affected by it, is the logistics issue. Because the road infrastructure in that particular area is almost non-existent because of the civil war which has been going on for years now. And even though our army, military has already arrived there, I think about 500 troops are there, the main sort of mission the initial force has is to establish the infrastructure which is required. Because there are no ambulances, there are no, for example, medical material they need, the doctors need like face masks, etc., medication, and they can't get it from the port to where their health centers are, which are located with the country port within a certain distance from the port city of Monrovia. And so the biggest issue, one of the biggest issues there is right now supply chain management. And of course, we at the Lake Washington Institute of Technology have started a new program, which is a bachelor's degree program in transportation and logistics. And only the day before yesterday, I was asked to comment on the situation in Ebola, and especially from the logistics viewpoint. And so even though it's not a national issue, but the fact that we are globally interconnected and it's a humanitarian issue, so it's very important to be familiar with supply chain and to know the geography first of all, and what the economy is like in different parts of the world. Before you get into any kind of trade, you have to know the economy of the different parts of the world, and somehow we didn't have the good understanding of the economies of Africa for some reason. Thank you.
Yeah, I definitely appreciate and agree with all of your comments. One of our we have a process set up in many of the countries in which we work to where we are developing relationships with local partners and have local staff that are on the ground and have been on the ground and know the different transportation providers that may not be known to those outside or those that aren't indigenous to that country. So, going back to that collaboration piece, developing those relationships on the front end so that you can call on those in times of need. In terms of the, yeah, there's definitely a lack of supply chain professionals globally. And you know, I'm definitely excited to hear about all the programs that are available to help fill that gap of much needed supply chain professionals, specifically in the humanitarian industry. You know, I think that's oftentimes, I know whenever I graduated, I had not heard of opportunities in the humanitarian supply chain field. I went into automotive. So I just look forward to continue to elevate the need for supply chain professionals in the humanitarian space.
So I just wanted to just touch base with one other person in the back room who's not looking up at me at the moment, but Pat Nancy, who is here with FEMA. And Pat, I don't know if you just would like to introduce him. Do you have just any thoughts that you'd like to add? Because we have, I wanted to introduce him because we have a great opportunity here today, because we have local people, local government, as well as industry, as well as state, as well as county. I mean, we've got a really good cross-section in education. So, Pat?
Right, yeah, thanks. No, I don't have any thoughts. I have a lot of thoughts. I don't think I have any thoughts that I want to add. Just trying to absorb it all. Appreciate the panel's comments and everyone's comments. Everything you said from FEMA and the federal government's perspective, all the grants, on the preparedness side, response recovery, we get it. It resonates. We have a lot going on in our little sphere, and work with the states and locals to try to address some of this. Exercises, preparedness plans, very sophisticated plans for CSZ scenario and so forth. So if anyone has any questions about those things, want to get with me offline, I'm happy to talk with you. Thanks.
So we're going to kind of wrap up here. We've got about 15 minutes left. We've got lunch to rise. But I would like to ask each of the panelists to think about any last thoughts that have occurred that they want to share, but also if you would focus on telling those of us, both in the private sector as well as in the education field, what do you see the critical knowledge, skills, and abilities that we need in the educational field to help translate for our private partners, for those students who are going to go and work in, and it can be in Homeland Security, emergency management fields, which are very broad, cybersecurity, law enforcement, et cetera, but also in our trade, supply chain management fields as well, other government sectors. So if you could kind of summarize any last thoughts, but also just give us that feedback, because that's what is, for us, a major takeaway. And we are going to be working on integrating and embedding these curriculums and things that we get here today into and across the system. So why don't, Gail? Wonderful.
I do serve on the Higher Ed Committee. I also serve on Technology and Economic Development and Transportation. And one of the reasons why I mention that is I am trying to break the silos of these committees. The most important responsibility that I think we face in this state right now is that we do have pockets of extraordinary work going on in the education system, both in the high school systems as well as in the community and technical colleges, the four-year regional schools, our research universities. We are very, very lucky, all right? A lot of educators are invested in this personally and professionally, and they are building a field, all right? All of the educators who are working these areas are building a field. And what that means is that 1,000 flowers are blooming everywhere. The students drive what the teachers want to do, all right? I worked at UW for 8.5 years, bringing in research money, education initiatives, working with the students, working with the faculty. The students really drive the faculty. If they are interested in it, the faculty want to take them there. And in the same way, the faculty help shape the students' awareness of what the opportunities are. I think one biggest need, first of all, is for the faculty running the various institutes and centers and research or efforts. And I was at Central Washington a few weeks ago and visited with the Cascadia Subhazards Institute. I didn't know about it. It was another new one for me. I'm going to be going to Western Washington in the next month. UW has a new center as well. Highline I've known about, Pierce College. It's everywhere. And Skagit has a fantastic operation going. So I asked the faculty and the educator leaders to make yourselves aware of where else it's happening, all right? Organize yourselves to meet on a regular basis. Come to the state and ask us for a grant. Go to the feds and ask them for a grant. Go to a private partner like World Vision or Toyota in Seattle. Ask them for a grant to help you organize your thinking and make sure that you're managing the curriculum in a way that helps. And then the final ingredient of that is give these students internships and mentoring and advising about what kinds of work they are needed in our community to do. We need them. And it's not just 18-year-olds and it's not just 20-year-olds. It's veterans coming back. It's the student who has been out of school for 10 years and lost a job. We have so much talent that is just crying for internships and advising on what to do with their talent. So I am a big advance push for internships, mentoring, and advising, and the faculty getting themselves together. So that's what I'd offer.
Yeah, and very similar to Gail, I think the foundation is the academic education that's being received. But I know whenever I was getting my bachelor's degree, I did an internship at Toyota, which provided a rounding out of that foundation to get the work experience matched with the academic knowledge. So I think the mentorship is a vital piece of any academic program. I know at World Vision we look for internships or for interns to fill roles within our supply chain team. So, I'd encourage you to reach out to those organizations, understanding their internship programs. How can we be made aware of opportunities within the organizations to match our students with internships? In the final piece, and I'll put my Toyota hat on for a little bit. From a program standpoint is to have programs that teach the Lean Six Sigma tools. And that helps whenever a student comes into an organization, can understand the current processes, the current operations, but if they have the Lean Six Sigma background, they're able to look at those and identify opportunities for improvement to ultimately at the end of the day become better. So small incremental improvements through the use of specific tools and methodologies. So adding that into any program. I know as an employer, I look for that as one, do they have the academic background, two, do they have the work experience, and then three, do they bring that Lean Six Sigma methodology that they can come in and make an immediate impact in our improving our processes.
Well, with a nod to Napoleon, because this is his quote, the physical, or the social to the physical is 3:1. Critical infrastructure has nothing to do with the bridges and all that stuff. We've got to reach people. We got to reach decision makers. We got to be able to influence people. It's all the social side of it. You can have all the technical expertise in the world, and it'll do you no good. I can tell you that decision makers are very comfortable with risk. Very comfortable. Especially if they've never suffered a loss in their, lifetime or professional career or what have you. So learning to talk about risk. The other thing I would say is marketing. Daniel Pink has a book, To Sell is Human. We are in the sales business. We're selling disaster resilience. You got to learn how to talk about and sell people on concepts that they don't really want to buy, because it means they're expending resources on stuff that then takes away from the bottom line, what have you. many times we emergency managers think that, okay, there's this huge event and it's directly transferable. It was in another place in the world or the nation. I'll take Hurricane Sandy, which had huge impacts to the maritime industry, the ports of New York and New Jersey. I can tell you the lessons that were learned on the West Coast and Puget Sound were zip. There is nothing transferred about that event to the risks that we have here from a seismic piece of it. Nothing, nada. We're going on. Terrible event out there, but okay, with business as usual from that standpoint. The other piece is, again, social. Nisqually was, the worst thing about Nisqually is everybody thinks they went through the big one, and hey, wasn't that bad, you know? A lot of negative learning happened out of Nisqually. Again, this human aspect of it. And the other thing I just would share with you is one solution is we're going to clone Representative Gale here. And actually, all we need is about a gallon of her blood to do this. But as an example, have a break. We're going to hook you up outside, right? But on 19 November, our organization, Pinware, we have a winter meeting. We're doing a half-day session on disaster resilience for legislators. Not for emergency managers, not for supply chain professionals, not for other executives, but really for legislators. And actually, Jen's predecessor, Glenn Woodbury, is going to come up and facilitate that. We got 10 so far. But yeah.
That's a good choice.
Yes.
Excellent choice.
Just to facilitate this thing, get them thinking about disaster resilience for legislators. Not what the governor does and all that, but what their role is before, during, and after event. I encourage you personally, reach out to your own legislator, whoever you know individually, and for this particular event, it doesn't cost anything at all to attend. We can tag them in. We're going to feed them a free lunch. Hey, and they can only get 12 now from lobbyists, and so this is a free lunch and won't count against the 12. So,
I would say in the world of resilience, an ounce of prevention is a pound of cure. The downside of that is an ounce of prevention costs a lot more than no prevention. And so how do you pry that money out? And that's education. And in the world, when you actually do have a need for a response, what you really find is you suddenly have a need for bureaucracies that are typically separate to start mixing in a big way. And to combat the basic immiscibility of bureaucracies, I think from an educational standpoint, what you want to do is do any process that leads to students getting out of the world that they're in and into a very different bureaucratic world. So through internships, targeted courses, experiences with that, all of that is going to be highly useful for in a response situation. And then as you educate more and more swaths of society in terms about the hazards and risks that people face, that tends to kind of pry open the money tree in terms of prevention.
Okay, when state directors of emergency management organizations get together and talk about education, and actually we do, we note that there's usually 200 or 220 degree and certification programs in the United States. And we often ask ourselves, what are they teaching? So we don't really know much about them. We've reached out a little bit and found, I'm comfortable with a lot of them, but there are some you wonder what they're saying, what they're doing. So it's a good question, but here's mine, because these other comments are all excellent, actually, and I include Eric in that. And for those of you who know that when I agree with Eric, hold them and it's news. We don't teach civics anymore. We teach people to drop, cover, and hold, and how to quietly leave during a fire in the 5th grade, in the 4th grade, the 3rd grade. But we don't teach them anything after that about what it means to be individually responsible and all of that. And so let me give you this thought. We need to teach individuals what their responsibilities are as citizens if there's a disaster, because citizenship, residency in this country, has obligations as well as privileges. And then we need to teach them what the role of the city, county, state, federal governments are. They are different. And we have to also make sure as those people enter industry, whether they, actually, I think we should be teaching entry-level emergency management courses in college and in high school. And I think people should at least go into the workforce knowing the difference between the federal government, the state government, the local government, their PTA, school districts, ports, and all of that. Why not? That's where they live. That's where they're going to make their money. I'd like to have a young person go into the insurance industry or go into manufacturing industry and have his own kind of common sense of what his or her responsibility is with respect to the people themselves and the people around them in a disaster, at work or at home. The second thing we need to teach people, and we need to teach adults this, and we need to teach elected officials this, I have to say, is that the federal government isn't the answer. Bless their hearts. They are great. This region, and Pat's one of them, they're the best in the country. No matter what they do, if they do their jobs perfectly, quickly, efficiently, effectively, which is even more important than efficiency, it won't be enough if, when they get here, they don't see a unified local community, business, public and private folks, state that's working cooperative with the local jurisdictions, and able to communicate with the feds and saying, this is what we need, but we've taken care of the rest of this. What we should be seeking is not just the big fist to pound on the federal door and ask for money, but they need to see a unified entity that's looking ahead to the future, even while they're dealing with an ugly present, and with a pattern of success that will give us some confidence that we can not only get through this, but come out of it better and stronger. That will keep businesses here, it will keep people working, it will keep the cash registers running, it will keep the schools open, it'll keep the roads open. If we begin to think about how we're going to do these things, all we've got to do, though, is look on the dark side, and all elected officials have to do is contemplate the press conference that they'll have to answer this question. What did you, governor, mayor, whoever you are, what did you know about the threat we faced? What did you do about it? And what was so important that you did nothing?
Well, I am going to just say a couple of wrap-ups because I want to respond to some ideas that you shared about what we need to do in the educational realm, and let you know that Jim and Gail, we are working on embedding into our high schools and our college programs. That's why you're here today, and we're the emergency management principles. So preparedness, understanding, and for those of you who may not know, FEMA has a term they coined whole community. And of course this involves not only us as individuals and as private entities, businesses, communities, but we are our own first responders, folks. And we, the global we, have to be personally prepared, professionally prepared, as communities prepared, in order to be able to help the quote-unquote first responders that we all expect to arrive on our doorstep in 5 minutes, which is, I mean, we have a wonderful system in this country, but they're not going to arrive in 5 minutes. And so that's part of certainly what we are working with as far as education and really working to embed those concepts and into our education system. And internships is a part of that as well. And so lean organizations, we do a lot on looking at processes. Civics, I think Eric and Jim, those are really excellent suggestions because we need to do that. One other thing Gail mentioned on the you all mentioned internships and externships, and which is critically important. And I do want to share with you that my center, as well as MAKES, we are